Well, good afternoon to you. As mentioned, I'm Adam Jacobs. I work at Poly. I work very closely with Microsoft on a number of different device programs that they have. You have to excuse me, it's a little bit early here. Despite my British accent, I am actually based on the West Coast, so not too far from San Jose. So it's 6 in the morning here, so I'm still booting up. So this deck, originally I presented at Ignite, but a lot has changed since then, and I've added a whole load of new content, and I've added a whole load of new information around how to troubleshoot, specifically with Teams devices, because we quite often I get involved in customer situations where they're having problems deploying the devices. There are various things that need to be in place to make sure that they function and get set up correctly. So we're going to spend some time today. So beginning probably like around 100, 200 level for those that are familiar, and then we'll ramp up to the more technical stuff towards the end. So, first of all, I'm going to just level set on these two categories. So Teams rooms on Windows and Android. We'll look at some of the feature differences between the two, because there are some subtle differences that you need to be aware of when you're fitting out meeting rooms. We'll look at the experience differences between them as well. So what do they look like? And deploying them, as I mentioned, and then troubleshooting. And if we've got some time, I'd love to hear any questions you guys have got. Okay. So back in 2020, Microsoft announced this new category, and at the time they called them collaboration bars. And essentially, this was because whilst they were running an application that ran a Teams room experience on it, they were all in one only. So the compute, the speakers, the mics, the cameras, everything was all integrated in a single bar. And then since then, Microsoft have been trying to sort of build out that category further and have more modular type endpoints where you can have separate cameras, separate speakers, separate mics. That's still something that's a little bit fluid with Microsoft. They're still, some of those more modular endpoints are still on the roadmap and not too far out, but they are coming. So anyway, long story short, they launched with Yealink and Poly, and the experience initially was very limited. It was very basic. It kind of looked like the smartphone experience, and it just wasn't anywhere near on par with MTR on Windows. So a new user experience was launched by Microsoft. They changed the category name to MTR on Android. And they essentially renamed the existing MTR category to MTR on Windows. And we started to see the feature set grow over time. So we're going to look at some of those features and dig into the details next. So this is fairly up to date, although one thing to be aware of is that Microsoft are bringing out new updates almost quarterly for Android, and even more often for Windows as well. Although on the Android side, they're more sort of rapidly introducing new features. So this is where we're at right now, but be aware that there are updates planned for Q4, which will, change this even more. So I'm regularly updating this. I should at some point probably put this on my blog so I can keep it maintained. So obviously, I'm not going to go through all of these, but I'll call out some of the key items. So the first one, obviously the operating system. And on the MTR for Windows side, you've got Windows 10, it's the IoT edition of Windows 10, but it's Windows 10 essentially. And Microsoft very recently released the 20H2 update for MTR on Windows. Some of you probably are wondering, well, why is it just not updating to the latest version of Windows 10? And Microsoft basically maintain which versions of Windows are being updated on MTR for Windows. So if you hit Windows Update on an MTR, you're not going to see all the latest feature packs being downloaded for Windows 10. Everything is controlled and tested by Microsoft before they get released. On the MTR for Android, no surprises, it's running Android, and of course, every vendor has different variants of Android. In the case of Poly, I can tell you that most of our systems today are running Android 8.1. We are transitioning to newer versions, and then Yealink and Logi will have different versions of Android as well. And one of the things that comes up is, well, why aren't you just running, the latest version of Android? My security team wants to make sure that we're running the latest versions to make sure that we've got all those security fixes that we need when we deploy these devices. And the thing to bear in mind here is that these are not smartphones, right? They are appliances. They have hardened versions of Android, which have been customized by the vendors. And more often than not, the version of Android on these devices is also tied to the SoC that the device is using. So for example, if I'm working with a chipset manufacturer like Qualcomm, and I have a specific type of chipset, they will tell me what versions of Android they support today, and then in the future as they move forwards on different versions there. So be aware of that, and we're going to talk a bit more about that later on when we go through the deployment guide. Some other things worth calling out. So direct guest join is a real killer feature on MTR for Windows. Obviously, that gives you the ability to have a basic join experience for WebEx, Zoom, and others are being added over time. That is in development for MTR on Android, but it's not there yet. It's not far off, however, but it's not there today. Whiteboarding, you can actually invoke whiteboards on MTR for Android on the system if it's deployed in personal mode, and we'll talk about that in a bit. Whereas on MTR for Windows, it's really geared towards meeting room mode as opposed to being deployed in a personal scenario. Magic Whiteboard or content cameras, that's not part of MTR for Android. Speaking of Microsoft, that's not planned either, so just be aware of that if that's something that you really need. Moving on to the next slide. Some other things worth calling out. The touch console experience. So some of you may or may not be aware, but MTR for Windows, the touch console experience is essentially an extended desktop. So it's the same PC. It's essentially like a secondary monitor, if you like, or third if you've got two people over in the front of the room. Whereas with the Android devices, they are, it's a separate client running on a separate device with separate compute, and it talks back to the system at the front of the room, and also to Microsoft's service as well. We'll talk about that in a bit. So be aware of that. There are pros and cons to that architecture. One big pro is that connectivity-wise, all you need is an Ethernet cable to connect the console. Some MTR windows will also do that, but others require USB cables and other ways to make it connect to the front of the room. Teams casting is available on both. That's a relatively new feature where you can use your Teams mobile client to cast your content from your device. There are background customizations coming soon, again in personal mode. Let's talk a bit about the experiences. So I think around 6 months back there was an update where Microsoft decided, okay, let's bring the two experiences together. Let's have them as close to one another as possible. And so what you can see on the left side there is the Android experience. On the right is Windows. Very similar. To be honest, I think the only difference is that you can see the schedule, the calendaring schedule on the front of the room when it comes to the Android experience, where on the Windows side, you have to refer to the touch console. The MTR for Android devices also support personal mode. Now, personal mode is basically designed where you've got a small Android device with a single screen. Invariably, this would be a touch screen, so you can drive it via touch. You could also use a mouse if you wanted, or a keyboard. And in that case, the assumption is that you're not using a touch console. So you can see you've got the controls on the front of the room. You also have additional controls via the touch console. And I'm going to break, there's a table I've got further into the presentation where we can compare some of the personal experiences versus meeting room experiences. And then also I'm going to talk about how you deploy the accounts, because the policies that you assign to the accounts are different depending on whether you want meeting room mode or personal mode. So let's talk a bit about Touch Console. This was something that was introduced not too long ago. And as I mentioned earlier, the MTR Android Touch Console has a separate application that runs on a device, and it needs to be paired with the primary endpoint. You're limited to one console today, so you can't have multiple, and you have to also today sign in with the same account on the touch console as with the front of room endpoint as well. Now, there is a roadmap that Microsoft has to try and reduce that, so you only have to sign in once, and Touch Console compare without having an additional sign-in with the same account to make things easier. But today, you need to sign in on both. Now, once you've signed in, the first thing you're going to see is this screen where it's looking for available devices. Now, one of the biggest reasons why this doesn't work is if someone is using a different account on the touch console to the front of room endpoint. So obviously make sure they're the same. The other reason why this can fail sometimes is if customers have not deployed all of the firewall configuration that Microsoft recommends. There's a big guide on all the different ports and IP addresses that need to be whitelisted for you to have a complete connectivity back to Office 365, and some of them are marked optional, and they're marked optional because the assumption is that not everyone is deploying Teams devices. I'm going to reference that guide later on, but bear in mind that the firewall configuration is something that very often, once you take your deployment outside of the lab into production, it's one of the main things that we quite often see fails. So at this point here, the device is talking to a service that Microsoft is running. in the cloud, and it's looking to see whether there is an endpoint signed in with the same account. Once it's found, it's going to basically pop up and say, hey, we found this endpoint, it's got this serial number, and if this is the endpoint that you want to pair with, then you essentially just click that blue box there, and the next thing you're going to see is a pairing code on the front of room user UI. That pairing code can then get entered on the touch console itself, which you can see here, and then once it's paired, once it's paired, it's going to basically give you the experience we showed earlier. If I come back to here, where you can basically see the meetings. Depending on your license, you'll have a dial pad, and also if you've got HDMI content sharing enabled, you'll see that share button as well. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about deployment of these devices. So when you deploy an Android MTR, one of the things that it will do is it will go off to Azure AD, and when it talks to Azure AD, it's going to basically walk you through a process whereby your system gets added as a device within Azure Active Directory. Now, you don't have a choice. This is something that Microsoft have chosen to be default behavior for MTR and Android. With MTR on Windows, you can choose. So actually, by default, the opposite happens. You don't get added to any AD, whether it's on-prem or online. And if you want to, you can add the system. If you want to push, specific group policies that you want to apply to an MTR, but it's not necessarily recommended that you go down that route unless you've done a significant amount of planning, because default set of policies pushed to an MTR in Windows can cause it to have some issues. So Microsoft doesn't recommend that. So because MTR and Android devices are being added to Azure AD, there are a number of considerations and things that you need to be aware of. Once the devices are added, whether they're MTR on Windows or Android, they will appear within the Teams Admin Center. And today, Windows MTRs will show up in Teams rooms, Android will show up in collaboration bars, and I have it I've been told by someone at Microsoft that they are in the process of changing those labels. They should get changed certainly within the next 2-3 weeks or so. At least that's what I was told. And so they will become Teams rooms on Windows and Teams rooms on Android, so you can tell the difference between the two, and they'll have the right name. So marketing moves a lot quicker at Microsoft than the folks that run the Teams Admin Center. So I'm going to just walk you guys through the process. So I mentioned earlier that Teams rooms on Android have to get deployed in Azure Active Directory. And that means a number of things. And we'll go through those when we talk about troubleshooting. But I want you to understand what the sign-in flow looks like, so that it makes more sense when we go through some of the troubleshooting later on. So first up, all Teams Android devices, whether they're phones, they're MTRs, they are Teams displays, scheduling panels, and all the different categories that Microsoft has got, they all include both of these applications. So obviously one application is the Teams app that runs the user experience, does the authentication, blah, blah, blah. Sorry, it doesn't do the authentication, it does the meeting join and gives you the UI once you've signed in. But the app that you get presented with prior to that is the company portal application. So let me just get my little pointer out here if I can find it. Here we go. So here's our company portal app. This is maintained by Microsoft, and vendors like Poly, Yale, etc. get newer versions of this application when Microsoft pushes them. Essentially, once you click sign in, or you generate a sign-in code, this is handled by the company portal application. So the first thing you're going to do after signing in is it's going to go off and it's going to authenticate. So it's going to check your account with Azure Active Directory, make sure your credentials are correct, and then it's going to come back. The next thing it's going to do is it's going to enroll you with Microsoft Endpoint Manager. Now, not everyone is licensed for Microsoft Endpoint Manager, and you don't need to be. One common misconception is that people assume you need an Intune license to deploy Teams devices. You don't. But if you do have Intune licenses, and more specifically, Microsoft Endpoint Manager deployed within your tenant, there are considerations you need to be aware of, because at that point on, you're going to have various compliance rules and things that get checked when you add these devices. And that's one area where things can go wrong, and we'll talk about that in a bit. Once we've talked to Endpoint Manager, and we're going to do a request to enroll and look at compliance policies, etc. The next thing that's going to happen is there's going to be this workplace join, and this is essentially where the device gets added to Azure Active Directory. So as a tenant admin, we can go into the portal, we can go into Azure Active Directory, go into devices, and I can see the devices appear here within that portal. And invariably it takes around, I think Microsoft's recommends it takes up to 8 minutes for it to appear in Azure Active Directory and also in the Teams Admin Center. Finally, once that process is completed, you're going to get a token back from Microsoft, and that token is going to be sent to the Teams app, and at that point forth, we're signed in. So there's a whole host of things that happen prior to the Teams application being invoked and signed in successfully that we need to be aware of. So let's talk a bit about deploying these devices. So first off, obviously we need a license, and we're going to need to create accounts. There's a load of hyperlinks in this deck. I assume the event organisers will share these decks with you guys. If not, I'll put it on my blog. So feel free to use the hyperlinks in here. They point to guides that Microsoft have got. So we're going to configure our accounts, and we're going to decide whether we want these systems to be used in personal mode or in meeting room mode. And there are a number of differences there that you need to be aware of. In personal mode, there are things that we can access without putting in a password, because obviously if we're deploying these devices in a meeting room, the last thing we want is a user coming in the room, accessing various admin type settings and changing things. So to restrict access to these settings, you want to deploy in meeting room mode. When you're in personal mode, you get access to these settings without password. You have the ability to sign out. You can start recording, whiteboarding, and you have access to various settings. Now, this list will change over time. It says here, for example, background settings can't be changed via the touch console. That's right now, but I know that will change, so just bear in mind. Meeting room modes, you have restricted access to calling settings, Bluetooth. You can't turn Bluetooth on and off. You can't sign out. So obviously the opposite of what we've got in personal mode there. You can also configure in meeting room mode auto answer, which is relatively new, which basically allows you to allows the system to automatically accept inbound calls to the system automatically. This was introduced just to give folks less need to connect to the room, or sorry, touch the console. Another thing just to be aware of, and this is just coming up in my mind, and I probably should have had a slide on this, is Microsoft has this room remote as well. So if you guys are running the latest Teams application on your mobile, you can also control the room via that app. And when you basically are in the meeting, proximity pairing will, basically alert you to the fact that you can use your smartphone to control the room, adjust the volume, accept the call, end the call, and stop video, etc. So, long story short, think about the type of account you want for your rooms, license them appropriately, and the experience is different depending on how those accounts are configured. So how do you configure them? So user accounts, you can see here we've got this policy, and the policy is configured for a sign-in mode of user sign-in. When we assign that to the account that's being used in, that will essentially make this room deploy it as a personal system as opposed to being shared or a meeting room system. And then if we wanted to deploy it in a meeting room, you can see the sign-in mode there is meeting sign-in as opposed to user sign-in. Okay. So, what do we do when things go wrong? And what goes wrong? This is kind of like a list of things that I've experienced when customers call up and say, hey, I can't deploy these devices. It's also some best practice that Microsoft has published. There's some really good guides that Microsoft published about a month ago. It was actually seriously lacking. And now they've sort of gone from like almost no documentation to like too much documentation. So let's walk through some of these. First off, things don't work if your time is wrong on your device. There's nothing new here. I mean, if you've been deploying phones previously, so 3-pip devices, or even just signing in your own Teams client, you need to make sure the time is right. That might seem simple and obvious, but quite often these devices could be configured with a stock NTP server, and they're put on a VLAN where the devices just don't have the ability to talk to the time server because, UDP port 123 is blocked. So be aware of that. It's one of the most common things that goes wrong. So ensure that your time and date is configured correctly. We talked about licenses. This is an obvious one as well. Obviously, you need to license your account or it's not going to sign in. And then the other thing here is proxies. A lot of customers still use proxies. Whilst Microsoft doesn't recommend proxies, in some cases it's unavoidable. You just have to use them. Certain financial organisations, they just have this kind of stock answer, which is we need to use proxies to access the internet. So you need to be aware of that. There are some limitations when you use proxies. Microsoft's applications don't natively know about proxies at all. So all of the proxy configuration is done at the Android application layer. So that's not the same across all vendors. Some vendors will support proxies, some vendors won't. And then there's configurations like, some customers will do things like content inspection. So they want to load a certificate on a device. That's something you can do very easily with an MTR on Windows. But when it comes to Android devices, loading certificates is a different process. It's not always the same, depending on the device type. And then Microsoft's applications, Android applications, don't actually know about the certificates. So they're not even reading the certificate store that they need to yet. So be aware of that as well. Long story short, proxies are not great with Teams, especially Teams devices. Endpoint Manager. If you're using Endpoint Manager in your organization, then chances are either yourselves or your admins have configured compliance policies which say only certain types of Android devices can connect to your organization. This is a big, big problem. And it's a problem because your smartphones are probably running the latest and greatest version of Android. And as I mentioned earlier, many of these devices, which are essentially appliances with invariably much slower SoCs and much less memory than you've got on your smartphones, they won't pass some of those compliance policies that are in place. So one of the things that Microsoft recommends doing is configuring specific bypass rules for Teams devices, and we'll talk about that on the next slide. But this is probably one of the biggest gotchas, and it's something you need to plan for, and people need to be aware of when they're deploying Android devices versus Windows. So yeah, that's a good one to be aware of. The other one here is Android Device Administrator as your sort of reference policy for management framework. This is an older legacy Google management framework, and a number of customers turn this off because, again, everyone's running the latest version of Android, and they assume that they can just turn this off and just use Android Enterprise instead. The problem with that is that Teams devices don't support Android Enterprise. So if you turned off Android Device Administrator, then they will sign in. So another thing to be aware of, we've had customers where they literally just said, we are not enabling that old framework in the story, and then literally their deployment stops. That's it. Firewall, there's this guide here which I've linked to. It basically lists every IP, every port that you need for various Office 365 services. There are optional things that people don't configure, and they think about configuring them when they're deploying Teams devices. Link is in the slide there. Last one that comes up is the maximum device count per user. So the default is 15 devices. Yes, the default is 15 devices. You cannot go above that. So if you're testing stuff and all of a sudden things stop signing in and company portal just jams up, more often than not, it's because your maximum amount of devices isn't there. So to clear that, you have to sign in with Azure AD admin rights, go in, search for the devices in question with the account that's maxed out that number, and then you need to clear them down manually. If you don't do that, you're literally stuck. You just can't deploy any more devices against your user account. Okay, let's talk a bit about conditional access. Recently there's a fantastic YouTube video. It's almost an hour long, but it literally goes through in detail how you can deploy conditional access policies and some of the do's and don'ts when you're deploying Teams devices. Thoroughly recommend you watch this. I created a blog post about a year ago. It's probably one of the top blog posts on my site that gets hit regularly still, on how you can configure bypass rules for devices. There are, since then, there's a number of new ways that you can do things, and those new methods are illustrated very well in this video. Michael Tressa works at Microsoft. He's created some great content and guides. Some of my content today comes from some of his guides as well. We talked about Intune. Intune is not a requirement for deploying Teams devices, but if you do have Intune, you need to be aware of these conditional access policies, and they need to be configured appropriately. So, MTR and Android systems and MTR and Windows systems have different log packages. So you can go into the Teams Admin Center and you can basically go to your devices and you can request a log package from the device. When you do that, it will wait for about 8 minutes till the device checks in, so queue the log download, and then usually up to about 15 minutes, that log package will be available for you to download. The log packages contain different things, depending on the device type. To be honest, when you look at MTR and Windows log packages, they're there's a lot of things in there which are pretty easy to read and understand. So, for example, you're going to find event logs in there, Windows event logs. You're going to find text files that include information about devices that are connected to your MTR and Windows. They're pretty easy to understand. However, when you get the log packages from MTR and Android devices, they're not so easy to understand. In both cases, one of the log viewers that Microsoft uses to look at these is a log viewer called LogJoint. It's available on GitHub. You can Google it, or there's a link in here to take you to it. It's a great log viewer. It can pass multiple log files, and it has a very nice way of going through the logs over a certain time period, so you can sort through. So, for example, if you're trying to reproduce an issue and you know what time it happens, you can go to that specific time on the side, and then it will show you what happened. Now, in this table here, again, this is from Michael at Microsoft. There's a number of different things you can search for in those Android event logs, or sorry, not event logs, logs, which will give you different readouts of different things depending on what the issue is. So this is good to keep. You can use these search terms to find out information. Okay, last but not least, just want to wrap up. So some of the things I just wanted to make you guys aware of, just to take away here. So MTR and Android, Windows, they're different, but they don't necessarily need to be deployed. You don't have to choose one or the other. They can be deployed side by side, and depending on the room types you have in your organizations, you can deploy different devices, either in certain types of rooms, or you can have them both deployed within your organization. It's, they both run the same media stack, the same, the same code is being run. There is common code across the two, which allows them to connect to Teams and give you the correct experience. So there's no one size fits all here. MTR and Android over time is going to adapt to larger rooms, and Microsoft is just very aggressive pushing new features. Their roadmap is in some cases published publicly, but not everything's there, and I know that there's a lot of new features coming in new updates on both Windows and Android. UX is very similar now, so you don't need to worry about training. your users. They should really be able to understand both quite easily. And then with Android, you have this personal mode versus meeting room mode, which is specific to Android. So, you know, can make AV integration easier on the Android side. MTR on Windows does have a better management experience today. That's something to be aware of. But again, that will start to grow over time. So I think that's visual time. We're at time. I suspect you guys have got to get to another session. If anyone's got any questions, or I don't know whether I'm going to be cut off abruptly or not.
No, you won't, Adam. Any question in the audience? Raise your hand. Yeah. Thank you.
You mentioned the management experience of Windows versus Android. If I was going to deploy, say, 100 room systems, if I chose Android, is that going to cause me significant overhead in terms of getting the systems installed over and above, Windows?
That's a good question. So I think so both of them require the system to be touched when you're deploying them, right? So you can't, we're still not in a position today where we can put a system on the network and it just configures itself. Android devices, recently Microsoft introduced, they called it one-touch deployment, but it's sorry, they called it zero-touch, excuse me, but it's probably two-touch. It just basically means that non-admins can deploy those systems. But they're both, from a deployment standpoint, it really depends on whether you're more comfortable with Windows versus Android. So if you're, some people like to literally create their own MTR or Windows image with specific drivers and admin agents on there. They want to manage them with, with Intune and have control over them. There are things you can do on Windows that you can't do on Android, but at the same time, because of that, you can break things on Windows a lot easier than you can on Android. So it really depends on the proficiency that your IT team has, and whether they're super into Windows versus just want something that's more of an appliance, if that makes sense.
Yeah. Okay.
Anything else?
Yeah, we have another question, and that would be the last one because we're running out of time.
Okay, sure.
Hey, when can we expect to see room panels from you guys?
Probably early next year.
Cool.
Yeah.
Thanks.
Yeah, you bet. Thanks very much, guys. Really appreciate it.
That was a good question.
Have a good rest of your day. I'm kind of measuring up now, so that's good.
Yeah. Thank you.
That's the event.
Thank you, Adam. I will stop the online meeting. So thank you for waking up so early for us. Thank you.
Yeah.